October 14, 1943. 37,000 feet above the German countryside, where the autumn air cuts thin and bitter. The metallic drone of Pratt & Whitney engines reverberates through aluminum fuselages as 291 American B-17 Flying Fortresses lumber toward Schweinfurt, their bomb bays heavy with the promise of destruction. In the cockpit of Yankee Doodle, Lieutenant Colonel James Stewart adjusts his oxygen mask, the leather cold against his face, while below, the patchwork of German farmland spreads like a torn quilt beneath gathering clouds. But this is not a story about bombers. This is the story of what happened when the hunters became the hunted, when laughter turned to terror, and when American ingenuity transformed the very nature of aerial warfare over the skies of Europe. This is the story of a fighter plane that German pilots initially dismissed with contemptuous chuckles, the North American P-51 Mustang, and how it became the sword that cut the heart from the Luftwaffe. By October 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had been bleeding over Europe for nearly a year. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing, championed by generals who believed flying fortresses could defend themselves in tight formations, was proving catastrophically flawed. Every mission beyond the range of Allied fighters became a massacre. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission alone would claim 60 bombers and 600 airmen in a single day, a loss rate that, if sustained, would have destroyed the entire 8th Air Force within months. The mathematics of aerial warfare were brutally simple. Without long-range fighter escort, American bombers were flying coffins. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, with its massive radial engine and robust construction, could escort bombers partway into Germany before fuel limitations forced it to turn back. The sleek Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, could fly farther but lacked the numbers and proved temperamental in European weather. Beyond their protective umbrella lay what bomber crews grimly called the Gap, hundreds of miles of enemy territory where Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s ruled supreme. Into this desperate situation came an unlikely savior, a fighter plane originally designed for the British Royal Air Force, powered by a British engine, yet destined to become the most successful American fighter of World War II. The P-51 Mustang had entered combat in 1942 as a competent but unremarkable low-altitude fighter. Its original Allison engine, while reliable, lacked the high-altitude performance necessary for escort duty. British test pilots, however, had recognized the aircraft's exceptional aerodynamic qualities. Its laminar flow wing design created less drag than any fighter then flying. The transformation came when Rolls-Royce engineers mated the Mustang's sleek airframe with their legendary Merlin engine, the same powerplant that had carried Spitfires to victory in the Battle of Britain. The result was aerodynamic perfection, a fighter that could climb to 40,000 feet, cruise at 400 miles per hour, and, most crucially, carry enough fuel to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. German fighter pilots had grown accustomed to easy victories by late 1943. Veterans like Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff of Jägerschwader 7 and Major Gunther Rahl of JG-52 spoke of bomber interceptions with the casual confidence of hunters discussing a particularly rewarding day in the field. The Americans, they believed, flew in predictable formations at predetermined altitudes. Their escorts turned back like clockwork. What remained was simply a matter of positioning and firepower. Oberstfreiter Hans Joachim Marseille, the legendary Star of Africa, had claimed 158 aerial victories before his death over Egypt in September 1942, and his tactics had become gospel among Luftwaffe pilots: approach from below and behind, use the bomber's blind spots, concentrate fire on engines and fuel tanks. The Americans, for all their industrial might, seemed to understand nothing of aerial combat finesse. Their pilots flew like formation dancers rather than predators. When intelligence reports first mentioned the P-51B Mustang entering service with American fighter groups in late 1943, Luftwaffe briefing rooms echoed with dismissive laughter. Another American attempt to build a fighter, the veterans scoffed. The P-39 Airacobra had been a disappointment. The P-40 Warhawk was adequate at best. Even the vaunted P-47 Thunderbolt, while tough, lacked the grace and agility of German designs. What could the Americans possibly create that would match the refined lethality of a Messerschmitt Bf 109G or the brutal power of a Focke-Wulf 190A? Major Hartmann Grasser of JG-53 later recalled the prevailing attitude: "We had heard the Americans were sending new fighters, longer-ranged ones. This concerned us tactically, but not technically. We had been fighting Americans for over a year. They flew well in formation but poorly as individuals. They had courage but lacked sophistication. Another American fighter simply meant more targets." The German pilots expected to encounter the same predictable opponents they had been defeating for months: brave but unimaginative flyers and aircraft that prioritized ruggedness over performance. They expected to maintain the tactical initiative, to choose when and where to engage. They expected American fighters to turn back somewhere over the Low Countries, leaving the bombers naked and vulnerable for the final run to target. They expected to continue winning. The first combat encounter between P-51B Mustangs and German fighters occurred on December 1, 1943, during a mission to Solingen. The 354th Fighter Group, flying their new mounts for only the third time in combat, engaged elements of JG-26 and JG-54 over Western Germany. What happened next challenged every assumption the Luftwaffe had made about American fighters. Hauptmann Johannes Naumann of JG-26, flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109G-6, recorded in his combat report, "Enemy fighter approached from 6 o'clock high. Appeared to be new type, sleek, single engine, bubble canopy. Initiated defensive turn. Enemy fighter matched my turn and closed distance rapidly. Aircraft performance superior to anything previously encountered from Americans. Disengaged using cloud cover. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. In that brief span, the 354th Fighter Group claimed 6 German fighters destroyed while losing only 1 P-51. More significantly, the Mustangs had remained with the bombers throughout the mission, engaging German interceptors over the target and during the withdrawal. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots found themselves fighting American fighters deep inside German airspace. Technical intelligence reports from Rechlin Test Center, Germany's equivalent of Wright Field, began reaching Luftwaffe headquarters within weeks. Captured P-51B components revealed construction techniques and design philosophies that German engineers found unsettling. The laminar flow wing, a theoretical concept German designers had explored but never successfully implemented, provided the Mustang with unprecedented efficiency. Wind tunnel data suggested the aircraft's drag coefficient was nearly 30% lower than the Bf 109G. More troubling still were the fuel consumption figures. German engineers calculated that a P-51B could remain airborne for over 8 hours at combat power settings, more than double the endurance of a Bf 109G. General Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, noted in his diary, "If these calculations are correct, the Americans now possess a fighter that can escort their bombers anywhere in Europe. This changes everything." Combat reports from January and February 1944 confirmed German fears. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group, converting from P-47 Thunderbolts to P-51B Mustangs, began accompanying bombers to targets previously considered beyond escort range. On January 11, 1944, Mustangs engaged German fighters over Osttersleben, nearly 400 miles from their English bases. On February 20, they fought over Leipzig, 450 miles from home. The psychological impact on German pilots proved as devastating as the tactical implications. Oberst Hannes Trotloff, commanding JG-54, wrote to his superiors, "Our pilots report being engaged by American fighters at altitudes and distances we believed impossible. The enemy maintains formation integrity while achieving individual performance previously associated only with our best pilots. Morale effects are becoming evident." Flight Sergeant Klaus Mayatush of JG-26, a veteran of 72 aerial victories, described the changing nature of combat in a letter to his brother. "The new American fighter is unlike their previous types. It climbs like our 109, turns nearly as well as a Spitfire, yet has the range to fight us over Berlin. Yesterday I was engaged over Brandenburg by an enemy pilot who demonstrated tactical awareness I would have credited only to Galland or Marseille. When did the Americans learn to fight like this? The answer lay not merely in superior technology but in the transformation of American fighter doctrine. Early war American fighter tactics had emphasized formation flying and mutual support, sensible approaches for pilots with limited experience facing veteran opponents. The P-51 Mustang's capabilities, however, demanded a fundamental shift in philosophy. Here was an aircraft that could outclimb, outrun, and outmaneuver most German fighters while carrying enough fuel to fight anywhere over Europe. Colonel Don Blakesley, the legendary commander of the 4th Fighter Group, revolutionized American fighter tactics to exploit the Mustang's advantages. His pilots were taught to think like hunters rather than shepherds. Instead of maintaining rigid escort formations, Mustang pilots began ranging ahead of bomber streams, seeking out German interceptors before they could organize attacks. They climbed to altitudes where the Merlin engine's supercharger gave them decisive advantages. They used their superior range to position themselves optimally for combat. Most importantly, they learned to fight like individuals while maintaining tactical coordination. The Mustang's excellent visibility and responsive controls allowed pilots to engage in a fluid, opportunistic combat that had previously been the exclusive domain of Luftwaffe veterans. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who would eventually claim 21.83 aerial victories, described the transition. The Mustang didn't just give us a better airplane, it gave us a new way of thinking about air combat. We stopped reacting to German tactics and started imposing our own. German pilots, meanwhile, found themselves adapting to an entirely new reality. The tactical initiative they had maintained for nearly 4 years of war began slipping away. Luftwaffe fighters could no longer choose when and where to engage American bombers. Mustang patrols forced German interceptors to fight their way through escort screens before reaching their primary targets. Even when they successfully penetrated to the bomber streams, Mustangs would pursue them during withdrawal, turning what had once been calculated attacks into desperate running battles. Hauptmann George Peter Eder of JG-26, a veteran of over 400 combat missions, later recalled, "The Mustang changed the entire character of the air war. Previously, we held the initiative. We could climb above the Americans, choose our moment, make our attack, and withdraw. With the Mustang, the Americans began hunting us. They climbed higher, flew farther, and fought longer than we believed possible." For the first time since 1940, German fighters were forced to fight defensively over their own territory. The transformation extended beyond tactics to the very psychology of aerial warfare. German fighter pilots had entered the war with supreme confidence in their training, aircraft, and doctrine. The early victories in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union had reinforced their sense of technical and tactical superiority. British fighters had proven capable opponents during the Battle of Britain, but their limited range confined the threat to specific geographic areas. American fighters had shown courage but lacked sophistication. The P-51 Mustang shattered these assumptions. Here was an enemy fighter that combined the performance of German designs with the range of American engineering and the tactical flexibility of evolving doctrine. German pilots found themselves facing opponents who could match their individual skills while possessing decisive advantages in numbers, logistics, and strategic mobility. Throughout this aerial revolution, one element remained constant in American fighter cockpits: the small, silver-hipped flask that pilots carried on every mission. Officially, the flasks contained water for emergencies. Unofficially, they represented something far more significant: the abundance and optimism that characterized American industrial culture. While German pilots rationed their coffee and flew missions with empty bellies, American fighter pilots carried flasks filled with bourbon from Kentucky distilleries that had never missed a production quota. The liquid inside represented grain from Kansas wheat fields, corn from Iowa prairies, and the craftsmanship of workers who had never known occupation or starvation. Each sip contained the essence of a continent that remained inviolate, whose factories operated 3 shifts daily, whose farms produced surpluses that filled Allied granaries across the globe. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group, who would become the highest-scoring P-51 pilot of the European theater with 26.83 victories, carried a flask engraved with the words, "From the Bluegrass State." Before each mission, he would touch the flask to his oxygen mask, not for luck, but as a reminder of what abundance looked like. Kentucky bourbon represented the luxury of choice, the freedom to transform surplus grain into something beautiful rather than merely functional. German pilots, by contrast, carried emergency rations of concentrated chocolate and glucose tablets, functional nutrition designed by chemists to sustain life rather than provide pleasure. Their aircraft fuel came from synthetic refineries operating at maximum capacity, producing gasoline from coal through processes that consumed enormous quantities of resources while delivering marginal results. Every gallon burned represented materials that could have been used for other purposes, other weapons, other desperate expedients. The contrast was philosophical as much as material. American abundance allowed for experimentation, for the luxury of perfecting the P-51's aerodynamics through hundreds of wind tunnel hours and test flights. German engineers, operating under increasing resource constraints, were forced to prioritize quantity over quality, immediate needs over long-term development. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, technically superior to any propeller-driven aircraft, remained in limited production because Germany lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce jet engines while meeting conventional aircraft requirements. As 1944 progressed and Mustang formations grew larger and more aggressive, the silver flasks became symbols of an industrial democracy that could afford to pursue perfection. Each P-51 represented approximately 50,000 hours of skilled labor, materials sourced from across an intact continent, and the accumulated knowledge of engineers who had never worked under air raid sirens. The abundance was not merely quantitative but qualitative, the freedom to design not just for immediate tactical needs but for strategic dominance. By war's end, P-51 Mustangs had claimed over 4,950 aerial victories in the European theater while escorting bomber formations to every major target in Nazi Germany. The aircraft that German pilots had initially dismissed with laughter had become the instrument of the Luftwaffe's destruction. Of the 36,000 German fighter pilots who served during World War II, nearly 28,000 would become casualties. Many fell to the guns of aircraft they had once considered inferior. The deeper victory, however, transcended mere statistics. The P-51 Mustang represented the triumph of a philosophy that valued excellence over expedience, abundance over scarcity, and democratic ideals over authoritarian efficiency. It embodied the patient work of engineers who had time to perfect their designs, the careful craftsmanship of workers who took pride in their output, and the strategic vision of leaders who understood that winning a war required more than winning battles. In the autumn of 1945, as Allied occupation forces catalogued the remains of German aircraft factories, they discovered wind tunnel models and design studies for fighters that might have matched or exceeded the Mustang's performance. The Focke-Wulf Ta-152, the Messerschmitt Me-309, the Heinkel He-280, all represented German engineering at its most sophisticated. Yet none had entered large-scale production because Nazi Germany lacked the industrial abundance necessary to transform theoretical excellence into practical superiority. The war had been decided not by individual heroism or tactical brilliance, but by the accumulated weight of democratic abundance applied with systematic precision. Every P-51 Mustang that climbed into European skies carried within its aluminum skin the productive capacity of a free society that could afford to pursue perfection without compromising survival. The silver flasks in American cockpits contained more than bourbon, they held the distilled essence of liberty itself, the luxury of choice that authoritarian societies invariably sacrifice in their pursuit of power. Major George Preddy never returned from his final mission on Christmas Day 1944, shot down by American anti-aircraft fire over Belgium in a case of tragic mistaken identity. His flask, recovered from the wreckage, was returned to his family in North Carolina. Inside, investigators found not bourbon but a handwritten note: "For every mile we fly, for every victory we claim, we carry the hopes of those who cannot fight." This aircraft represents their faith in democracy, their belief that free men can build better machines and fight with greater purpose than those who serve tyranny. The note captured the essential truth of the P-51 Mustang's victory over the Luftwaffe. It had been won not merely by superior performance or tactics, but by the fundamental advantage of a society that could afford to dream of perfection while building the tools to achieve it. The aircraft that German pilots had once dismissed with laughter had become the sword of democracy itself, sharp, swift, and guided by the accumulated wisdom of free men working toward common purpose. In the end, the P-51 Mustang proved that abundance, properly applied, could triumph over efficiency. That patience could defeat urgency. That the slow, careful work of democratic society could produce weapons more deadly than any forged in the furnaces of authoritarianism. The silver flask, empty now of bourbon but full of meaning, remained a reminder that freedom's greatest victory lay not in what it could destroy, but in what it chose to create. The laughter had died in German throats, replaced by the whisper of Merlin engines carrying democracy's children home.